All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to the fifth lecture in the NYU Game Center guest lecture series. My name is Frank Lance. I am the interim director of the NYU Game Center. And thank you all very much for coming. A couple of quick announcements. Before we begin, I want to plug some of the classes we have coming up. This summer, there's a summer workshop in game design, which is going to be awesome. It's an intensive 6-week studio course that takes students through the entire production process. So it's going to be a very hands-on studio class where you go through the entire process of making a game from conception to design and play testing and iteration and production and coding and bug testing, and then at the end you have an awesome digital game. So that is something that is well worth checking out, and I believe there are also some scholarships available for that. So if that's something that's of interest to you, let us know. In the fall, we're going to have
yeah. Scholarships.
Yeah.
If you're interested, just reply to that gamecenter.nyu.edu and mention you'd like to take the class and you'd like to be considered for scholarship.
Yes.
And we'll get an application to you.
Yes. In the fall, we have 2 new classes that the Game Center is launching. Both kind of foundation classes. One is called Introduction to Game Design, and that is going to be a class about the underlying principles of game design outside of the context, the specific context of digital production. So it is about how to craft a compelling game experience. It's still very much a studio class, very hands-on. You'll be working in small groups, designing and building non-digital games in order to understand the underlying principles that power digital games as well. And then there's also what we're calling Introduction to Video Games, which is kind of a almost like an art history survey class about the history of the field, but with a strong kind of theoretical, analytical component as well. Different ways of looking at the form of video games and digital games and understanding how they work. So both of those classes are in the fall, and you should check them out. So as always, I'd like to thank the people who make the NYU Game Center possible. Generous donations from the Rockefeller Foundation, from Sharon Chang and the TTSL Charitable Foundation, and other generous donors. I'm very excited about tonight's guest speakers. It's Eric Zimmerman and Katie Salen. They are very active both as practitioners of game design and development, and also as scholars and teachers. The reason that I asked them to come together as a pair of people to speak with us is that 5 years ago they co-authored a book called Rules of Play, which is a really interesting and important text in game design. The first book that really makes an attempt to establish a kind of overall theoretical framework for thinking about game design as a design discipline, and a really important book. So they're going to each speak briefly, and then we're all going to sit down and chat, and we're going to open it up and talk to everybody. So I think we're going to start with Eric Zimmerman. Eric has been a game designer for how many years? A long time. 12.
Professionally or
yes.
otherwise?
Yeah, professionally.
15 years.
15 years. Co-founder and chief creative officer of the local game development company Game Lab. He's also been a teacher here at NYU, at MIT, at Parsons, and various other places. Has written a lot about games. Is a well-known, outspoken kind of pundit in the world of games. And I also think that one of the reasons that the NYU Game Center exists is really Eric, because like 12 years ago, he was the person that suggested, hey, let's teach a class in game design at ITP. So we went and talked to Red Burns. Red Burns said, sounds like a good idea. And that was really, I think, the seeds of this whole thing. So without any further ado, Eric Zimmerman.
Thank you. Whoops. First, thanks, Frank, and the NYU Game Center for having me out here. I was just telling Frank before this, I think that I don't know, most of you are students here, and I think they're getting a little spoiled. Because I have to say that the lecture series that Frank put together for you guys this semester is the best game design lecture series that I've ever seen, let alone actually been privileged to sit in on. So Warren Spector, Jonathan Blow, Ian Bogost, and Mark LeBlanc. I mean, those are four of the most interesting and important people in game design. So I guess that sounds a little bit self-promoting since Katie and I are part of the series, but certainly up until now, it's been the best game design series lecture I've ever seen. So thanks, Frank. You really did a great job in both form and content, because I also like the way you have very brief talks and have us talk together. So I just put together a few slides to talk about some of my interests. So that, and I wanted to talk about what drives me as a game designer, and also show some of my work, both things that I did outside of Game Lab, because that's what most people know me about, the company I ran for the last 9 years, as well as also showing you some prototypes for projects as well. But it's just images, not other stuff. I think that in a certain sense, when you're a student and you're thinking about what you're going to do with your life, the question is not really what can you do, because people are capable of doing a lot of different things, but really what's meaningful to you. And I think that for me, games are something that I've had a passion for, not just playing, but creating my whole life. And I think that in a certain sense, the interests that I have drive an ongoing investigation of just making games. And the games themselves are sort of the residue of me pursuing those interests. So this is just a series of some of the things that drive me. One of that Frank mentioned is game design as a discipline. When we started teaching about 14 years ago at NYU, there weren't classes in game design, there weren't textbooks on game design, and we had to really think about what it meant to design games. Frank and I both came from an art background. And the discipline means a lot of things. For example, it means a critical vocabulary that lets you talk to other people doing the same things that you're doing, so that you can have a sort of a high-level advanced discussion about what you're doing, get to know it. I put together a conference called Replay, which was, as far as I know, one of the first times that game academics and scholars got together with game designers and critics. This became a book. Katie actually played a big part in Replay as well. Including the design of the book. Rules of Play, Frank mentioned, I co-authored with Katie. The Game Design Reader, which is an anthology, was a follow-up. I think in a sense, this Game Design Reader is interesting because it really pointed out a sort of a community of people writing around games. It includes both historical work from philosophers and anthropologists, as well as writings from game fans and designers. Another interest of mine is subversive play. So there's a lot of ways that we can frame play as narrative. We can frame it as social interaction. But there's a sense in which, if play has a funny relationship to rules, that rules are these sort of orderly, logical, regular things that are almost scientific in their clarity and order and mathematics. On the other hand, play is sort of the opposite of rules. Play is improvisational and creative. And play, in the case of games, only exists because of those rules. But in a certain sense, it sort of works against them. There's a lot of games that I've made have sort of played with this idea of subverting a context. This was a game I did when Frank and I were working at RGA Interactive together. This was a game that was designed for an office environment, and it was called Suspicion. And you had an identity. You belonged to two groups you can see on the right. You didn't know at the office who was playing the game. and you didn't know which groups they belonged to. But you sort of found out over time, and both the games took place over a week of real time. So it was a sort of appropriation of the existing office context, and it subverted the power relationships in the office. So you could really, for example, screw over your boss, and there were tears and conflicts and a lot of wonderful conflict in the office because of this game. Playful, distracting conflict. Another project I did, which is a sort of around subversive play, was not exactly a game, but a media hoax called Arm the Homeless. And I'm showing this because I did this when I was in graduate school, created a fake organization with a group of students called the Arm the Homeless Coalition, the purpose of which was to provide firearms and firearm safety training to homeless people. This was in the very beginning of the 90s, like 91, 92. We completely fooled the local media. And we're on international CNN and all these things. And the lead singer from Rage Against the Machine put Arm the Homeless on his guitar as a tribute to it. And I was looking for an image from our project, and I came across this, and I'm amazed that that meme still exists. And as far as I know, this is a reference to that guitar, which is what is a reference to our project. In that case, we're really playfully subverting the media through hoax. Sissy Fight was a project I did before starting Game Lab. Subversive play on a lot of levels. Gender politics of representation in games. Everyone is a girl here, but the girls aren't. The girls are neither pinup sort of action sluts, nor are they sort of princesses to be rescued. There's something else. There's sort of these ugly, funny little girls. There are a lot of wonderful things happen on Sissy Fight in terms of the community and other forms of play. I've done a lot of games for conferences as well. Game Lab did games at conferences for about 8 years, and this was one that I did with Marina Zurko for a game in New York called Blur. And these were cards that you could play that at any time during the conference, and as you can see that they did things to conversation and social relations. Not exactly a game, but a very game-like play intervention designed for a conference context. Games and narrative is another interest of mine. Thinking about the intersection of games and storytelling, again, it's a very rich, deep topic. For me, the question is always not how can I get game stories to be as good as literature or theater or film, but instead, what are the kinds of stories that only a game could tell, both in terms of form and content and experience for the player? This is a project that I did with a designer named Nancy Nwachek, Life in the Garden. We're seeing all images, but each page has an image and then some text on the other side. And you shuffle the pages, you pick 5, put them inside the covers of the little book, and it's a coherent story every time. So as opposed to surrealist language games that they did things like The Exquisite Corpse, which were more meant to make surreal juxtapositions that were more collage-like, for me, I've sort of inverted that in this project, and the idea is have a random system that creates coherence every time, which to me is a kind of design magic, a sleight of hand. Both in the sense of a stage magician and in the sense of magic in the more mystical sense. We explore narrative in a lot of our games at Game Lab. This is a screenshot from a game called Mismanagement, M-I-S-S Management, which is about office politics, which really feels like a sitcom as you play. So it uses a little bit of a Diner Dash style core gameplay, but there's a tremendous amount of narrative and episodes that unfold through the play. This is a screenshot from an early prototype of a project I'm working on called 30 Moments. And just to show you what a sort of ugly screenshot looks like, but this is a game that is set at the turn of the 20th century, so New Year's Eve, 1899. And in this case, we are having extremely modular stories that are sort of put together as you play. And there's a sort of strategic game of wandering around the city looking for revenge. This is another example. I said I'd show you guys some prototypes. This is a board game called The Unfinished Tale that I'm working on. And in this case, the narration occurs through social gameplay. And stories get put together in a few different ways. Another thing that interests me is the idea of emergent systems. You know, I talked about rules in play. One of the aspects of play is that play is unexpected. So if you really knew how a game was going to turn out, you probably wouldn't start playing it in the first place. And so the idea that there are emergent or unexpected things that come out of games, and that games are intrinsically systemic, is also very interesting to me. Gearheads was a project I worked on with Frank. My first commercially published game came out in 1995. In this game, each player has a collection of wind-up toys. And you choose toys for your collection, 3 or 4 of them, and you have them in your box. And then all you do is launch them against a screen towards your opponent. And you decide how long to wind them up. And also you decide where to launch them in 1 of 5 launch spots. So you are sort of affecting the system from the sides, launching toys in. And what's interesting is that the toys all can affect each other in unexpected ways. Once you launch a toy, either player can score with it. All you're trying to do is get the toys across the screen, across the opposite side of the screen as your opponent. But what's interesting is that toys can push each other, they can reverse each other's direction. Some toys are immune to other toys, and you end up creating little engines, combinations of toys. So it's a little bit like a Magic the Gathering card deck in which the cards are sort of these living wind-up toys. And for Frank and I, this was part of the pleasure of designing this project and also designing the AI as well, which is that it is a system that rewards you for exploring and exploring different combinations. Again, that's a quality that we don't find as directly in other forms of art, entertainment, media, and popular culture. The idea that as you're interacting with it, you are literally exploring its possibilities, the ways that it can function in a systemic way. So that idea of an emergent system is important to me. These are more examples of conference games I designed with Frank. Also Manifesto and Link. Again, when you're in a social context, one of the wonderful things about designing games that are social is that there is emergent complexity, unexpected patterns come out. My interest in games ranges across the digital and the non-digital. And I think that for me, they're all learning contexts. This is another board game that I designed that was published in a magazine called 21C. Visual design with Karen Seidman. And in this game, a different idea of emergent complexity. This board game borrows from Conway's Game of Life, and you are creating little organisms that have different parts that interact with each other in different ways. In this case, the emergent complexity happens through strategic possibilities, through the behavior of the organisms themselves. So when we talk about how emergent complexity can happen in game, we can talk about it across a number of ways. This is a project that was a project that Game Lab worked on for a few years called GameStar Mechanic. In this case, this is a screenshot of a player creating a game. So this is an online community for kids that lets them create games and share them with each other, and it's all within a narrative context. The site is live right now. The public beta is live right now, gamestarmechanic.com. In this case, the idea of thinking about players as designers and blurring that boundary is another example of sort of emergent systems. The wonderful thing about being a game designer, I think probably the sweetest pleasure, is seeing players do things with your game that you never anticipated in advance. Which again, my background is as an artist. So when I was a painter and making objects for a gallery, sure, people interact with what you create in a cognitive sense. They have a different emotional experience. They have a different interpretation of what you do. But with a game, you're really providing players with a box of tools, and they help create their own experience. It's more akin to being a composer and seeing how a musician might interpret your music. In the case of games, what players do with your games could be more radically different, in my mind, than what a musician might do with a sheet of music, at least in a classical sense. And so it's wonderful in the case of GameStar Mechanic to have created a system that lets people create games. You're sort of squaring the possibilities. They're not just playing games, but they're making games that then other people play. And it's been wonderful, even in its very, very early stages, to see this project evolve. I should mention that this was funded through the MacArthur Foundation grant that was received by James Paul G., who I think I saw sneak into the room a little while ago, and also the Institute of Play, which Katie Salen is running. We're about to see a slide on that anyway. Just a second. And I should say that also Katie had a big hand in designing this, and Greg Trefry was the lead designer more recently on the project. Is also in the room. Transforming the game industry. So this is another thing that also really interests me as a game designer. So far, I've talked about ideas of emergent complexity, subversive play, games and narrative that are really more focused on design itself, making design decisions. And I think that it's wonderful to be able to lose yourself just in the design of a game and not concern yourself as much for the context. But ultimately, as designers, we're creating culture. And if you think about everything you're experiencing right now, the seat that you're sitting in, the clothes you're wearing, the light that's falling in this room that allows us to see each other, the food you're digesting, all of that was design. Designers made that stuff. Design in the broad sense of design. And as designers, we create the world in that sense. And so you're never just creating something in isolation as a designer, even as a game designer. You're creating something that exists within a context. And so just as language and words and style and fashion and everything gains meaning through context, games also gain meaning through context. And it's important that we understand that. One of the contexts in which I've worked as a game designer is the game industry and thinking about what's wrong with the game industry and what we might do to change it. So Game Lab, company that I co-founded with Peter Lee in 2000 and ran for the last 9 years, was an attempt to really create a platform, a context, a community, a collaborative group that could make experimental games. And at the beginning, when we started it, we always used a language that we're sort of independent filmmakers of games. And at that time, the idea of independent games was not in common parlance. And as it has in the last few years, sort of come into being as a big buzzword. And I think that we, to large extent, succeeded on that. We made a lot of games. These are some of our downloadable games. We did a lot of web games, downloadable games, and in a certain sense, I'm very proud of the work that we did. But I'm even more proud of the sort of context that we created for creative collaboration. And in that sense, our games at Game Lab were experiments. At Game Lab, the company was also an experiment as well. In addition, there's lots of stuff that I do in the game industry as an advocate to try and think about how we can transform things. This, just as an example, I do at the Game Developers Conference for the last 5 or 6 years, I think, the Game Design Challenge, where I give 3 well-known game designers a weird and unusual game design problem. This is actually a slide from the year that they all had to design around a license, the license being the poetry of Emily Dickinson. This is from Will Wright's talk, a slide from his talk, which won that year. So he actually had a Emily Dickinson that sort of sat on your desktop and commented on your email that you evolved a relationship with over time. And again, when I started doing that, I think it was a little bit more unusual, the idea of experimental gameplay, unusual topics for games, and it was a bit more radical. Now, of course, the experimental gameplay workshop and the idea of doing experimental games is sort of more common now. But I think that this is an example of me always wanting to think about what am I not seeing at the Game Developers Conference? What are sessions that I need to fuel my own passion that I think would be important for the industry? And things like the Game Design Challenge grew out of that. Finally, games and culture. I mentioned that the game industry is one context for thinking about games. Well, culture is also the culture at large, right? Society is another important way of thinking about games. What we're doing, how they gain meaning, why we're doing it. And there's a million ways of thinking about how games interact with their cultural contexts. I've designed games for galleries. This is a shot from a project called 3 Games for a Gallery. I like designing games for galleries. In a sense, it's sort of pure research, right? I get to work on projects that don't have to be sold or commodified. And it's a sort of wonderful excuse to explore issues surrounding games and game design and game culture. This is an example of a project that was in Artist Space several years ago called Push that involved these large foam blocks. The Institute of Play, I think, it was another attempt to think about the relationship of games to culture. It started as sort of a notion that Peter Lee and I had, the two co-founders of Game Lab, and we quickly brought in Katie Salen, who's the other speaker here, who's really taken it and gone way, way, way beyond anything that we had ever expected to do with it. I'm sure she's going to be talking about it. But in that case, it was thinking about relationship between for-profit commercial game studio and a nonprofit, and what might be the intersection or effect of that kind of interesting interinstitutional collaboration. And this is an example of a game I collaborated on with Karen Seidman. That was for a political party that a friend had. Again, just thinking about how games can act within culture in certain ways. This is the final game that I'm going to show, which is a project I'm working on that's a sport called Gridball. I was commissioned by a conference that's happening. Ian Gabogos is one of the organizers of one of the other speakers here, to design a game that was also art. And I decided that I wanted to design a sport. In this case, I'm thinking about games and culture, not in terms of, say, games and learning or games and politics, but the idea, for example, that most sports that we have are based on 19th century models of society and character and identity. What would it mean for a sport to be designed in this century? But that also had everything that's beautiful about a sport and elegant and simple and competitive about a sport. So this is a project that I'm just starting to design and should be appearing hopefully in a more finished form next spring. So these things are among the many interests I have. There are plenty of others, but I just wanted to share with you some of the things that drive me as a designer. I think that it's really important to, like I said, be critical about what's driving you as a game designer, why you're doing what you're doing, what's meaningful about it for you, and find ways of following that passion. Thank you very much.
So our next guest is Katie Salen, someone that has been a big influence on me personally in terms of thinking about how games can be meaningful. As a designer, she's done some fascinating projects that involve transforming urban space and turning a city into a game space, combining karaoke and ice cream trucks. And kind of intervening in different social spaces in really interesting ways. As she's also done a lot of serious and important work as an educator. She is the director for the Center for Transformative Media at Parsons, the New School. She's also, as Eric mentioned, the director of the Institute for Play, and at which she's been involved in a project called the Quest to Learn, which is a K through 12 school that is going to launch, I believe, with the 6th grade this fall. And it's a school that is built entirely around using games as both an inspiration and a structure for learning. So, Katie Salen.
Thanks, Frank. So I have to be honest that when Frank asked Derek and I to do this, it was months ago, actually, that invitation came. And I thought, great, awesome, we can talk about it. It was framed as, Rules of Play is a text that's been around for a long time. Can we now begin to have a conversation about potentially what's changed since the point at which that book was written? Where are we now in terms of thinking about the future of games, the impact potentially games or game design has had more broadly on culture? And I thought that was an awesome topic. But as the day began to get closer and closer and closer, I really struggled with, well, how do we even sort of enter into that space? And so I'm hoping we can enter into it primarily through conversation. But one way I thought that we would frame it is I want to start with a little piece of machinima. Because in some way, machinima represents the thing that I love most about the sort of larger field of games and game studies. My way into game design really came by way of sort of film and cinema, and also by way of interactive design. And I remember the moment back in 1998, Austin, Texas, 2 in the morning, in a house with a friend of mine working on a film festival, when we downloaded Father Frags Best, which was one of the very first pieces of machinima made in Quake. And I remember having my mind blown, that I just could not wrap my head around what was going on. Because I had never heard of game engines. I mean, I played Quake, but I didn't really get the notion that you could produce a kind of sitcom inside of Quake engine and the sort of weirdness of it. And as I began to sort of dig deeper into that culture, I really began to celebrate everything again that I love about games. And one of them, and Eric touched on this a little bit, is the kind of transformative, transgressive nature. I am most interested in games not because you can make more games, but because what games do allow us to think about the design of other kinds of things in really new and imaginative ways. So I'm just going to show you a tiny clip. This is an interview I did with Chris Burke. Do you guys know this Spartan Life? Some of you do. So this Spartan Life is a talk show that's done inside of Halo 2. And Chris is a super interesting guy. He's big in the Game Boy music scene, does lots of music stuff. But he's been running this talk show for a couple years. And he invites people in and he sort of talks to guests about game theory. And so I went over to his house last summer. It was like 100 degrees outside. Went to Prospect Park, went into his house. And he sort of interviewed me in Halo. And it was very awkward, and you'll see this, is because I hadn't played the Xbox for a long time. I'd been obsessed with PlayStation games for a long time, and DS. And so I was having a really hard time working the controller that his son has customized to be, of course, in the opposite direction that I like to play. So there's very, very funny moments. So in the interview, we're inside SourceForge, and we're actually playing in a map that people are building as we're interviewing, as he's interviewing me. And so the whole point of this conversation is to look at the idea of play, the idea of how games are creating interesting spaces for people to do stuff, build things. And it's like tapping your head and rubbing your stomach to sort of try to play Halo, navigate a map that's changing as you're walking around, and also sort of speak intelligently. So I don't speak intelligently, but at least it'll give you a little bit of an idea of sort of what I think about and how I think about it. Chris is going to do a little introduction. It's very hyperbolic. It's a little over the top, so just ignore that. It's
Okay, before you start, I want to just hit the lights. So
Okay.
Bring the lights down on the screen. Okay.
All right, where is our sound? Our guy fixed our sound and now he left. Audio? Did our person leave, Jason?
James left. Yeah.
James? He had to hook something in here.
He did a test.
Yeah.
Let me call him.
Okay, we'll just skip over this part.
Well, how did he change between these two?
Well,
Yeah,
it's not related to that because you can hear it sort of doing the audio.
Oh, you can? Then we'll put a speaker up too. Where's it coming out?
No, you can just hear the flutter.
Oh.
Okay, anyway. You can go online and look at this. Just Google this Spartan Life. Actually, you could all open your laptops and we could sort of watch it together. Okay, let's see. Luckily, I have a kind of backup plan. Okay, so anyway, what you'll sort of see in that interview is me talking about ideas of why play matters, and why I think games matter. And so I'm just on this screen here. I'm just running through a bunch of stuff that I've worked on in the past couple years. So that's just sort of eye candy. You can glance over there occasionally and then glance over here occasionally. You know, back when Eric and I worked on Rules of Play, which was not that long ago, I guess 6 years ago, it seems like eons in the lifespan of game design and sort of the academic discourse around games. Rules of Play was a very, very different book 6 years ago than it is today. In some sense, it's a very, very simple book, but it was the first time that I think I personally had sort of grappled with issues of how does one begin to develop a kind of discourse around games. And when I sort of started thinking about, well, how is Rules of Play relevant to me today, and how are games relevant to me today, what I think is that games today are incredibly influential, and that we begin to see the impact that they have, not so much again within the game industry, but outside of the game industry. And the work that I've been doing for the past 2 years has been in the games and learning space. And if you want to talk about an industry that is scared to death of a form that they also simultaneously want to embrace, it's games. And so one thing that I've been spending a lot of time talking to my students about is that you have to really understand what does it mean to be a game designer today, because you actually have tremendous influence. People from other design disciplines, whether it's architecture, whether it's product design, whether it's broadcast design, are continually coming to game designers to say, well, how can we design more engaging experiences for our audiences? And so I think that we have to understand a lot about the power of our craft, and also kind of how we can apply it, where it can be shared, and what other people might be able to learn from the kind of craft of game design. So some of these images that we're seeing now, I've been doing a lot of work recently with teaching younger kids how to design games. And the first time that they design a game, they have the same look on their face that I had on my face when I saw Father Frags Best, which is this moment of kind of disbelief about what is possible when you kind of get play right. And I have to say it's a very interesting experience. This is a motion capture lab that I've been doing some work with called Small Lab, that allows us to build sort of embodied games where kids are working with wireless controllers. We've been doing a lot of work with mobile games and kids, different kinds of handheld platforms where they're able to track information, use information in the classroom, and thinking broadly about this notion of sort of play breaking boundaries and games breaking boundaries of the screen. Yeah, I don't really want to talk specifically about all these projects, so we can sort of just look at them. The school that Frank mentioned, it's a new public school that will open in the fall. It's actually a 6 to 12 grade, not kindergarten. Luckily, we're not starting with the little guys. But it's a school that we designed from the ground up around principles of learning. Principles of game and game design. And so we've just recruited our first class of kids. We've been hiring teachers. And it's been a phenomenal journey for me to begin to look at games so closely, to understand how to design institutions based around the kind of principles of game design. So I can talk about that a little bit in Q&A if people have questions about that. All right, what just happened? Okay, do you want to try the?
Yeah, let's give it one more shot.
Okay. Oh. I'm gonna get it. Right, no, it's not. Oh, sorry.
On life
Okay.
with your horse, Damian Latin.
Thank you.
She's a professor in the Design and Technology program at Parsons School of Design in New York. Her extensive academic resume makes it difficult to imagine that she'd also have time to actually work in the fields of gaming, design, and animation. But she has for clients such as Game Lab, Microsoft, Richard Linklater, the Buckminster Fuller Institute, and others. Welcome to the Spartan Life, Katie.
Oh, it's great to be here, Damien.
Katie, the interactive aspects of gaming seem to set it apart from other forms of entertainment media. Can you help us sort out exactly how it fits in?
The biggest difference between games and other kinds of media is that they're interactive. Oh, there we go. But it's probably the most fun thing about what we're doing here is that I have a chance to sort of walk around and move to make choices about where I'm going, what I'm looking at, what we're doing. Games are also rendered in real time, and in the map here you'll begin to see as we move around that there's stuff popping up all the time. And that makes them very dynamic, interesting environments for a player to begin to respond to. And because of that, players find them incredibly empowering because they have a chance to make choices in these spaces, whether it's in the design of them or in the play of them.
And the internet really seems to have driven this explosion of DIY media, you know, with YouTube videos, blogging, remixes, and gamers seem to be a big part of that. Is there something about games or the games industry that encourages that?
Games in the beginning, digital games, were designed by programmers, and games were small enough that they could be designed by a single person. And as they grew in complexity, there still was the kind of history of computer science and programmers building games. And because they were fluent with code, they often thought about ways that they could give access of that code to other people that they can then modify and tweak the games. And a lot of early games were released with level editors, and there was a kind of open invitation for players to come in, make changes, modify levels, build new mods, build new tools for the game. And that actually led to a whole culture of production where players really felt like they were part of changing the game.
Oh, sorry.
And what we're seeing here is just really built on that tradition.
All right, I'm just going to skip forward a little bit. So there's a whole thing going on where Chris is trying to keep all the players out of the space so that they don't start a battle while we're inside, which of course happens at some point. So let's see.
So we were talking about DIY media, and it seems to me that it benefits kids in particular, you know, because they share what they do with each other, they collaborate.
I think absolutely, and one of the things that I find most amazing about games and why I think they have had an incredible impact is that there's so many different ways you can manipulate the media in and around games. So players might build maps like we're looking at here. Players might spend time developing skins. They might be writing fan fiction. And again, because games allow you very quickly to see kinds of changes that you might make and that you can share, it's a very empowering kind of form. And Machinima is a great example of this medium that's a sort of cross between gameplay and theater and movie making.
Hey, check it out. I think you ought to try this vehicle out. Jump in.
All right, here. Okay.
Yeah, you'll love this. Some serious alien technology here. So try your right trigger.
Nice.
I'm trying to give you a weapon here to defend yourself.
All right, well, you were standing right in front of me, dude.
All right, just warning you, we've got some gamers joining. You've got a nice weapon now, though, so you'll be fine.
Up there. Oh, I see here one second.
Yeah, it's going to spiral out of control real nicely.
Okay, I'm gonna get out.
Oh, damn, did they get you?
No, I just got out. Oh, now I'm dead. It's me.
Hey guys, no burning the guest alive, please. I know this is technically a Slayer match and all, but we need to lay down some rules, or this is... Everybody, this is Katie. We're shooting, bad choice of words. We're recording an interview, and if you just stop for...
Maybe if I wait long enough, the Marines will just deal with them. Oh, it sounds like the... Lieutenant.
Okay, we're back with Katie Salen, and there's been a discussion here on how to proceed. I think we're going to be all right. So Katie, the idea of emergent gameplay comes up a lot in your writing and your work. Games are not a static linear medium, as we know. It's a world that's always in flux in some way. Can you talk a little bit about the concept of the sandbox?
Well, sure. So we've already talked a little bit about how games are interactive and the fact that because they're systems that have to react in real time to players, that there are all kinds of emergent behaviors that happen. I mean, the other big piece is the idea that we're in a multiplayer space here, and once you begin to put a lot of people together in the same place, you sort of never know what's going to happen.
Ow! I'm getting hit by falling crates here. I think I've stumbled into electronic sandbox hell.
So the idea of the sandbox is games like Grand Theft Auto was one of the very first ones that sort of took on that moniker of a game that had such a depth of different kinds of options, of kinds of gameplay that people could engage in, that they really became spaces for people to determine their own kinds of goals, their own kinds of gameplay options and things that they wanted to do in the space. And when you take it to the extent of something like the source course maps here, you can begin to talk about the virtual space, and the code base really is a sandbox that allows people to use their imagination to build whatever they would like to build.
Something that comes up a lot in our discussions is what Ken Wark and others have said about changes in transport and communication throughout history as this trend toward further and further abstraction of places, things, and even experience. And that it might be leading to this sort of random access future where everything is modular and interchangeable. So is it too much of a wide-eyed futurist thing to say that games are like early training for the virtual life of the future? I mean, hopefully without the whole alien war thing going on.
Oh no, I think absolutely, and I think that with the rise of digital technology, people have learned to inhabit multiple spaces sort of simultaneously. And people used to always talk about you're in the real world or you're in virtual space, and now people are really thinking about them as blended. And they're in some sense thinking about reality as quite modular. Whoop, there I go, flying around.
Okay, things are obviously falling apart here, so feel free to defend yourself.
It's hard not to shoot people, I must admit. Where'd you go?
Just in the middle of a death match. Stay there, I'll come over to you. Oh, there you are. So it's fair to say then that gaming and digital culture in general are having an increasing effect on our daily experiences?
Oh yeah, so it is interesting. That identity is split and distributed across spaces. I mean, if we look at the number of social networks, for example, a single person might be part of, just with usernames and passwords, you can really think about that as quite an abstraction of identity, in a sense of self, in a sense of kind of location within communities. So I think that as the way the technology is handling representation is becoming a way our experience is also being handled.
Great. Thanks, Katie Salen, for joining us. I hope the shrapnel and explosions don't cause any permanent trauma.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much.
So, I mean, it's weird, right? The kind of chaos of that environment. But the thread of the conversation is really reflective in sort of what is going on in that space. And I sound like I'm 12 years old. Do I really sound like that? My voice sound like that? So anyway, I really like this series, and if you guys like that sort of clip, what Chris is doing, you should definitely check it out. He's done some interviews with Ken Wark and some other really interesting kinds of things. You know, I've been following the machinima scene off and on, you know, back since '98. It moves at a kind of glacial pace, which is very interesting. I dip back in every couple months, and there's always still kind of the same game guys making the same kind of game movies. But occasionally there's some really innovative, interesting things that are going on. So I still remain completely fascinated by it. So I'm going to stop there.
All right, so you guys come and join me, and let's flip these lights up. So I want to start by picking up on something that you brought up, Katie, which is how things have changed over the 5 or 6 years in which you guys wrote Rules of Play. So it seemed like a very different time back then, and I think there's a lot of ideas in Rules of Play where it really felt like you were introducing kind of a new way of looking at games and thinking about games. And in some ways, a lot of those ideas have caught on or become more prominent. In other ways, it seems like things are more the same than they have ever been. So what do you guys think about how the world of games has changed over the past 5 or 6 years?
Well, I mean, in terms of Rules of Play, I think one of the things about that book is that programs like the one that you were putting together 5 or 6 years ago were pretty rare. And academics and people that really weren't in the game industry or game players were very resistant to games. Educators were. It's amazing. I think it's really the last 2 or 3 years that we've seen a radical shift. You know, games go back and forth being accepted, not accepted. Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man, they were popular. Sega CD, Genesis, Night Trap, they were really unpopular for, but Mortal Kombat, right? So it goes up and down. But I'm doing this consulting with Long Island University now. They're putting together a master's program, and last week I met with about 20 different faculty, and none of them were game players, and all of them were just desperate to like integrate games into their curriculum, which at that time, 5 or 6 years ago, you never would have seen that. It's to me, I don't know, a similar thing happened maybe photography in the 80s. There were big debates about, is photography art, is it not? Should photography be in the Museum of Modern Art? Is it high art or not? And it's funny, and these were like big debates and turf wars. And then a few years later, there was sort of no question. It had become integrated, and part of that happened because the art world was losing its sort of purchase on culture at large. And so they then started saying, oh, right, outsider art is art, and photography is art, and we can get more audiences if we expand the definition of what art means. And maybe something similar is happening with games. You see things like the Wii and the DS that are opening up new audiences for games on iPhones and online. And so the audience is getting bigger and more inclusive.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It is, in some sense, the game industry still feels like it's frozen in a block of ice. Like it will always kind of, parts of it remain making the same kind of games, sort of forever. And I think that's okay. And I think we've seen, as Eric talked about with the DS, with the Wii, and also with mobile, beginning to be some kind of satellite spaces around that of new kind of spaces for innovation, new kinds of spaces for play that may not be quite a game, but be very game-like. But I do think that there is a difference in people's kind of acceptance even of the term game, and a weird thing that's happened with identities. So, everyone always asks me, well, how did you get into game design? Were you a gamer when you were a kid? And my answer to that is no, I wasn't a gamer. I was an athlete, and I always feel like that's my way into it. But early game designers really self-identified as gamers. You could point to gamers in culture, and they were a particular group. They dressed a certain way. You go to GDC, they're there. You can see them in mass. They're there. But something began to happen 10 years ago where games became like water in terms of media available to people. And kids today play games. They do. It is part of what they do. And they don't self-identify for the most part as gamers. There's a small subset that might, but most kids sort of accept that games are part of what they do. And so I think there's something very interesting there that the gamer is no longer a sort of specialized way of being in the world necessarily. And you and Karen talk about this notion of a kind of gamer's intelligence, and I think there's beginning to be a larger acceptance that the infiltration of the play of games on how we see the world is there, and it's beginning to kind of affect how we approach media, how we approach social engagement, interaction with other people. So it's some sense there's been a permeation of the sort of game meme in a way that has, softened the edges around games in a way that I don't know is great.
Really?
Of course, my whole practice the past 2 years has been premised on the idea that I think it's great.
Yeah, and now you're not so sure.
No. I just wonder if there's something great about feeling special and marginalized. And I think it was really cool, well, in a certain way, really cool for a long time to like be a game designer, to be a game academic studying a field that nobody else would touch, to get tenure in a field that nobody else would touch. And now, it's kind of not so unusual to be an academic doing game stuff. It's not unusual to write a text about games. It's not unusual to be an anthropologist sort of studying games. So I think that's a normal arc, but I think that there is I think a little bit the rarity.
Let's follow that up a little bit, because I'm curious about this myself. So there's two kinds of stories about what's happening and what will continue to happen in the future. One of the stories is that games becomes, for the 21st century, what cinema was to the 20th century, a kind of the way that the global imagination describes the world to itself, right? This kind of, and that's a myth, right, about cinema even, but it's, it kind of makes sense, right? This was something that, like you said, was like water available to everyone and became just part of the way we thought about the world. And games will do that and become this kind of universal thing accepted in that way. But there's another possibility, which is that they will never quite achieve that status, that awkwardness, that edge that you're talking about that separates someone who self-identifies as a gamer, someone for whom this stuff is profoundly meaningful and an important part of their life, from people who dip into it occasionally or who have it as a little bit part of their life. But there'll always be that kind of separation. That awkwardness is not just an adolescent phase that we're going through, but it's actually something that we'll find, this is just part of what games as culture are all about. Are either one of those stories, which one do you think is more likely? Or is there some other version that you think is more likely?
I think it's going to be, and I haven't thought about this before, so this is a complete me thinking out loud. I think it's going to be the former with a bit of the latter. Mm-hmm. Like I do. That's a safe, a diplomatic answer, maybe. I do think, and this is again why I like games, I think games don't neatly fit in. There is something about them that has a kind of resistance to fitting into other things. Yeah. And I like that about it. It has to do with the subversive play that Eric is talking about. They always have the potential to really behave badly. Yeah. And in that way, like more of a potential, I think, than cinema does, because it's in the form itself, because people are part of the system, and people always have the potential to behave badly, especially when given permission to do so, which is one thing games give you
There's
permission
that,
to.
and there's also just the sense that games always seem to be about upending value systems. Right. Like let's pretend this, and then we kind of turn things upside down, and let's pretend to kill each other, right? And that seems like pretending to kill your friends will never quite be woven into day-to-day life the way that listening to a story is, or even singing a song is.
Right.
Does that make sense? I feel like that.
Yeah, I agree with Katie. I mean, I think that both of those scenarios will come true. One thing that we have to remember about games is that games are not new. Games are ancient. They're they're an ancient form of human expression, like image making, and even non-human animals play. But human culture, games is near universal. And so in that sense, the geekiness of digital games is a little bit of a recent phenomenon. Like, for example, part of the geekiness of digital games is that they were single player for a long time, or hot seat multiplayer, in an arcade sense. And now they're sort of returning back to their multiplayer roots. On the other hand, I think that getting deeply engaged with a game is different than getting deeply engaged with other forms of media for a number of reasons. As opposed to cinema, for example, the closer you become to being an expert player in a game, you actually start to think more like a designer. So in order to really play a game deeply, you, in a sense, have to think like a designer more than a film buff has to think like a cinematographer. You can be deeply engrossed in the culture of film and not really know basic rules of editing, for example. But with a game, if you're going to play a lot of games well, like a real-time strategy game, you end up having to reverse engineer the game in order to figure out where are the weak points in the other players' possible strategies that you can sort of exploit. And I think that those modes of engagement bring you more into a kind of I don't want to say geekiness, but
that's maybe one of the reasons that it'll maintain a little bit of that kind of hobbyist.
Right,
culture,
and it's funny. I mean, I've had my own sort of journey as a game designer. Playing. I played games and made games my whole life. It's just been something that I've loved doing. So think about like starting Dungeons and Dragons in 5th grade and getting very, very engrossed in that. On the other hand, then coming into the game industry, I thought, okay, I play hardcore gamers games, but why not make games for people that would normally play games and experiment with new forms of gameplay, but that are really simple and approachable? And that was sort of Game Lab's mantra, right? Experimentation, but for a broad audience. Now that sort of casual games and mass market games are becoming so commonplace, I'm wanting to sort of re-embrace complexity and difficulty. And maybe it's because there are plenty of other people now that are pursuing this sort of casual interaction and that kind of thing. But there's something to thinking about, if you look at a game like poker takes over people's lives. you know? But yet, what is there's no virtual space you're exploring in poker. There's a deck of cards on the table. Somehow within that space and the social space of the players around the table and the context in which those play takes place, these huge universes of possibility and lifestyle and personality and self-expression open up, you know? And so that, to me, that kind of depth and richness is really fascinating.
So let me ask a little bit more in this direction. I mean, one of the things about rules of play is that it's quite straightforward and clear in terms of looking at games as an aesthetic form, right? And that's one of the things that makes it such a strong text. Am I right in saying that?
Well, you're quoting your own introduction.
Am I?
Yes, I think that's
Okay.
great.
In that case, well done. Okay, and that is a new thing, right? So games are ancient, but this approach, with looking at games, game design as a design discipline, and kind of looking at games as an aesthetic form, is a newer way of thinking about games, right? Because we don't. Yes, we've had games as part of our lives, and we've enjoyed them, and they've been rich and meaningful and transformative and important. But until now, we haven't really thought of them in the same breath as we thought about stories and poems and paintings and dance and music, right? And now we are kind of doing that, and it feels natural. But there's also there are things about that don't sit comfortably. So you talk about poker, right? So if we want to look at Halo as an aesthetic form, we want to look at Ico and the Shadow of the Colossus as these aesthetic objects. In some ways, it's easy to look at Shadow of the Colossus and say, well, that's an aesthetic object. It looks like a film. It's beautiful visually. But it's harder to look at baseball or football. It's harder to look at poker and say, oh, that's also an aesthetic form. Partly because it's harder to find the author, it's harder to trace back to the designer and say, oh, this is a form of expression, that this person had a point they were making or something that they were expressing personally. And maybe that's part also of what makes them harder to assimilate, right? And that, I mean, I don't know if you guys agree with that. Do you feel like it's easy to then look back and then bring those things with us into looking at games as aesthetic forms, or will there always be a tension there as well?
Well, I mean, I'll disagree a little bit. I don't think rules of play is about the aesthetic, is games as aesthetic forms. I think part of it is, and in fact, in your introduction, I think you called about the aesthetics of interaction.
Yeah.
Which is actually what I think rules of play is about. So,
Okay.
and I think there's a difference. So, you know, my way into rules of play and even beginning to think about games was I really felt like I needed to understand how they worked. And part of it is that I was teaching a course in interactive design. I started using games, the lottery of all things, to teach my students about great interactive design. And once I began to do that, I realized that, wow, games really get interactive design. They really get participation. They really get that seduction of the player. Like, how do you call somebody into a space? And then how do you hold them there? And so, you know, for me, rules of play was all about just trying to figure that out. So how is it that games work? And I do think that a lot of the game design discourse over the past 5 or 6 years has been along that track, trying to say, first, is there such a thing as the craft of game design? And I actually think in 2000 that was a questionable question. There was a sense, and I think Eric has talked about this, and Mark LeBlanc too, that it was a sort of magic art, black magic art, that games got sort of invented by people who had things in their head, and they sort of went Shazam, and then there were games that got made. And then I think, you know, the past 6, 7, 8 years, people have started to study games in a way that maybe hadn't been done in a broad way before. I mean, I think historically there's always been people probably that have been studiers of games. But I think it's the first time that we begin to understand it within an academic discourse. And I think what is challenging about it is that I feel like as much as we've studied the form, and those of you that have tried to make games know this, you can feel like you know the basic mechanics, the vocabulary, you should do this. Sometimes the game just doesn't work, right? And so I still think there is this thing unknowable about what makes a good game a good game. And I mean, I think if we knew that, the game industry would be probably not in the disarray that it is in.
Ooh, I just have to say, when you say there's something unknowable, I get a shiver through my body. I mean, for me, there's, you know, you look at a game like Go versus chess, and the idea that chess has more rules, more kinds of pieces, and you would think that, you know, special openings and things like that, that it's a more complicated game. But Go, in part because of a bigger grid, but with an extraordinarily simple rule set, is far more complicated, and we haven't yet programmed the program that can beat a Go master. That, to me, there deep mysteries of the universe lie in those kinds of ideas about rules and play, structure and complexity, chance and uncertainty, decision making and meaning, that go to philosophy and metaphysics and ethics and sort of deep wells of human thought and mystery. So I just, you know, to me, there's so much about, and game design is a way of trying to find meaning and make meaning in the world and out of life, for me. I mean, it's really extraordinary.
Yeah. And I think game design for that reason is not for the faint of heart. Those of you that are thinking about going into it, I was telling someone yesterday that the number of, the question, we were and actually was today a charrette with people that didn't really know much about games, but were trying to understand the design process. And the question was, well, what is the, how often do you sort of get it right? And I said, well, probably 1% of the time. And there's hundreds of iterations always with hundreds of any game that you make. Because it is so challenging. And I think for that reason, it's so alluring for people who really, really want to understand it. And so in some sense, I don't want game design to become demystified, which I think it's going to resist that. But I sort of love that there is a big black hole in the middle of what we know about sort of how games work, why they work.
So how important is it to have a theoretical framework? Why write rules of play in the first place? If it is this more kind of intuitive process or this more mysterious process, what's the value of a big fat textbook on it?
Well, sure. So I guess what I'm not saying is that it's a mysterious process. I think that a lot of it is knowable, but I think there is the X factor you can often talk about. I mean, I think the value of it is the more you understand it, the more you can figure out, well, how can it apply to the design of other kinds of things, which is what I really care about. And I think it's a way.
Really?
Well, games
So you're more interested in the way that learning and thinking about games can be applied to other forms of culture,
as opposed to more than designing games.
Just making more games.
I am, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Eric?
What about you? You're just interested in games.
I'm much
for their
more
own sake.
oenistic, I think, and solipsistic, or however you want to put it. I'm interested in games in and of themselves, but for me, my personal investigation into being a game designer to me is a way of understanding how the world works, how people work, you know, whether it's in terms of politics or doing the right thing, or so. Maybe it's the same thing as Katie. It's just a different orientation. Yeah. But being a game designer to me sheds light on the world. And why is that? Partly because game design is radically interdisciplinary. So when you think about games, you have to think about mathematics and logic. You also have to think about aesthetics and storytelling. You also have to think about human emotion and society and culture. You know, a game is not played until it's played. So design in that sense is an intrinsically humanistic enterprise because you're always designing for someone in some context or another, and that's how meaning emerges. And so to be a designer is to put yourself in someone else's shoes, whether it's an abstract, you know, human-computer HCI sort of theoretical abstract person, or whether it's a particular individual or a particular audience. So it's, to me, games are a way, being a designer is a way of making sense in the world. So it's not, so maybe I'm exaggerating when I'm saying it's more oenistic and solipsistic, but I think as an artist, my orientation is always as a production of culture, and I'm also driven by the modernist bug of wanting to make forms of culture that I have never seen before. And that's has been a big driver for me as well.
It's fascinating. I feel like we're taking a look. I've never really thought about this before. I feel like we're kind of opening up the hood and looking at the engine that produced Rules of Play. This dynamic between the two of you. And I never realized how kind of complementary it is. But your approach, which I think comes, you know, through filmmaking and cinema kind of originally, and is always kind of interested in the points of contact between games and the rest of the world, and interaction and so forth, and interactive systems. And then, you know, Eric in some ways like the kind of uber formalist in some ways, right, drilling down into the heart of game systems and thinking about them. But in both cases, the real interest is in the world. I mean, you make games. You're interested in drilling down into games because they like any form of any aesthetic form can be elevating or can teach you something about yourself and other people and the world around you. So in both there's this complementary way of connecting to the world.
Yeah, and there's I mean, Katie and I definitely meet around the other side too. I mean, Katie you're very much a structuralist in the way you think
it's
about
true.
things.
I mean,
And
she did
for
say
example,
getting play right, which is the term. It's so important when their eyes light up when they get play right, which is classic kind of formalist way of thinking about that. And this topic kind of introduces the idea of games and the way they do have an impact on the world. So like political activist games, games for social change, and things like that. That's something that both of you guys have worked on a little bit. And what's your take on this? Because it's a growing field. You guys excited about this? Excited about making games for political activism and social change?
So I'm going to say something probably a little politically incorrect.
Okay.
I have to say I have a very hard time with putting games in sort of buckets around. There's games that are serious and games that are educational and games that are political and games that are activist. I just have a resistance to it. And this is in the same way, again, this is probably going to be very not politically correct, that I've had a resistance to panels on women in games at conferences. So my whole point is I'm a woman in games. Why would I want to sit on a panel of women in games which just calls attention to the fact that we're marginalized, which in fact we are marginalized, which is okay. So I want to speak at the main conference on a panel with people in the game conference. So I have a personal kind of issue around sort of saying games are this or that. I'm deeply interested in the idea that games can be used for a range of purposes. But it's hard for me to stomach the kind of separation that there are only certain games that can be considered activist because the intention was activist or they're using activist content. I actually think games can be used, any game can become an activist game based on the kind of context that it's played and how it's used. And so I actually really grapple with this because I'm on the advisory board of Games for Change, and I really want to support them. The Values of Play project, I'm on that project, but I have a very contentious relationship with sort of how I feel about that and where that dialogue is going. And
well, perhaps you support them best by being honest about the things that you just said.
Right.
I think one of the premises of rules of play, which interestingly maybe was so obvious or has become so obvious people don't talk about it, is that for you and I it was like a major kind of brain problem to work through, is that the book is organized in terms of schema, what we called schema, which is that every chapter offers a different frame for looking at games. Some were more formal on rules, some were more experiential on play, and some are more contextual about culture. But the idea is that if you look at literature, we can look at all of literature in terms of the politics of gender representation, or in terms of the history of the printing press, or in terms of the rhythm and flow of language itself. All of those are really valid ways of looking at literature, and have been used to study literature. And all we did was say, there's a million ways to look at games too. You can look at them as systems of randomness and chance. You can look them as Mark did last week, as systems of formal feedback loops. You can look at them as systems wherein social interaction takes place. You can look at them as systems within which meaning is generated through a semiotic process. You can look at them in the sense of the way that they interface with cultural context and then undo them. Whatever you want. All those are valid. And so for me, because they're a rich cultural form, I think for me, when I look at Games for Change, they're seeing games as activist, context for activism, which I think is fine. I think the problem is when it gets very... that becomes a narrow, schema. So in rules of play, here's 30 schema, right, which are on your Batman tool belt that you can sort of put this lens out and schema and look at games it this way, and then, this isn't appropriate to this design problem. Let me look at this way. But I think that the problem is when they become very pedantic and flat-footed. So I have similar, and ultimately I agree with you. This thing about educational games, it's like, is there really a game which is as educational as chess? really. You know, in all of the ways that it is in terms of learning how to win or lose, what a set of rules is, the mathematics and problem solving and logic, and you can learn other things from other games, but chess is no less noble as an educational game.
Right. So one thing that in the program at Parsons, there is a strong sort of social activist bent. It grows from the history of the New School as the University in Exile, and it is sort of the way. It's a position that people that teach in that program take. It's a position adopted by many of the students that want to come there. So we don't have a class necessarily for activist games because it's the position of the designers approaching their games that they have that activist position. And so it comes out in the work that they make. So I actually think that the value is in the perspective of the game designer, and it doesn't sit in the game. It perhaps sits in, the worldview, the kind of choices that are being made, again, the context in which the game that gets made is situated, that is for me the most important thing around the dialogue of Games for Change or Games for Education. And I wanted to talk to you, if we can get to that, just about this idea of game design education.
Yeah,
you
great.
guys are starting a program here,
Let's talk about it right now. So I would love to get advice from you guys. And let me ask you something just really super specific, which is, so let's say 5 years from now, the two of you are looking at the NYU Game Center. What are the kinds of things that you will see that will make you say, oh, that was a big success? And conversely, what are the kinds of things that you would look at and say, NYU Game Center really didn't live up to its potential? Give us some concrete examples of, for those of us, who are building this thing out. It's going to become a program, and what would you like to see?
Well, no, I've been thinking about this. The truth is, so I've been doing kind of game design curriculum since, I don't know, 2002, not that, for years. And the truth is, the curriculum kind of looks the same.
Okay.
It kind of looks the same. You have to understand the history of games. You have to know basic sort of fundamentals, how to design games. You have to understand, as it maps to the current industry practice, what is the development process by which those things happen. You have to begin to be very fluent with what are the game forms and the technologies that are being used. But in every program that I see around the country, it's the sort of same sequence of stuff that you go through. So I think that probably is going to take a while to evolve until we understand a little bit more about what does it sort of mean to be a game designer in the world.
And that's what you are hoping to see?
No.
So
that's a sort of infrastructure question.
Okay.
What I'm hoping to see is lots of games.
Okay.
Obviously, that people here are making games.
Right.
I would love to see people making games that seem to be having an impact in a range of contexts that they find important and valuable. I would love to see the program take on a position about what it believes about game design and game development, that it isn't a sort of generic program, but there's a real kind of sense of like, what does this program care about? I would love to see that. I would love to see a diversity of participants that are in the program, diversity in all aspects in terms of what games are being made about, in terms of who's participating, in the program. Those are some things I would love to see.
Wow, I don't know if I have much to add.
Yeah.
I do defer to Katie's like much vaster expertise as a game educator. I just to echo Katie's last comment, I think that you have to have the fundamentals well, but a program needs to really figure out what its mission is, what its identity is, what's going to make it distinct. 3 or 4 years ago, it was incredibly unusual to have any game program. Now, every major university, community college, design school, they all have some game-related programs. And the question is, what makes it special? You know, the way that you can compare the NYU film school to the USC film school as, as a rivalry and as very different approaches in terms of methodology, in terms of who's teaching there, in terms of what the students go on to do afterwards. You want to have that kind of specificity of the program. But I also think that, ideally, as Katie said, you create a context. I think that the experiential context of any program is really important. When you walk into the space, the physical space that the game program is occupying, will you know that it's a game program? Is there a sense of play there? Are there things going on? Does it feel like things in process? I even as an undergraduate, I was actually in a little BFA painting program within a huge graduate school of fine arts, which was mostly design. It was mostly architecture and landscape. And there's just such a great sense of process walking into like big rooms with architects, working till 5 a.m. In the morning on their models and cardboard around and stuff like that. So that I don't know that sense of process and play is important.
It's excellent advice. I mean, we are starting to figure out what our identity is. I agree with you that I think that's important. I mean, I think one of the ways that we want to be understood is that we take a strong stance on the notion that games are an aesthetic form, that they're interesting in and of themselves. So sort of like in this dichotomy, is probably a little bit more towards this chair than that chair, in the sense that the thing that what we're taking a stance on is the fact that games are interesting and important to study in and of themselves, the way that music and film and dance and writing are as a creative form. Having said that, I think that they are the aesthetics of interactive systems, and games have this deep and essential relationship to computation. So that they are an aesthetic form that has this deep, really important relationship to engineering and science and logic. So I think that's kind of, we're trying to figure out our stance. And also, you mentioned the NYU Film School and its relationship to Hollywood. I mean, I think there's an opportunity to learn from that and have an identity that's informed by the fact that we're in New York City, one of the sort of global capitals of creativity, and that we are outside of the central orbit of the game industry, and that can be a source of creative power and freedom, and it can inform the work we do. It's we take a pride in being independent and urban and so forth.
It's funny that you say that what you're doing is closer to this chair, because I remember recently seeing a map of the Quest to Learn, which is the school that Katie's organization is designing, of their curriculum, and at the center is, I think, mathematics. Right, there's Center Hub, and then all these other.
Game design and systems.
Yeah, game design and systems. So there's, it's fun. I think that,
all these chairs are pretty close together. Let's admit it. And so speaking of New York City, I mean, one of the things that we want the Game Center to do is help make the game development community in New York City even more robust, and to help it thrive. One thing that co-founder and chief creative officer of Game Lab.
Chief design officer.
Chief design officer of Game Lab.
Only jerks have the title chief creative officer.
I'm sorry.
Oh, that is your title.
No, it's not. It's not. Creative director. So Game Lab has gone through a major transition recently. You guys are changing, and maybe you can, I don't know what you can say about that, but maybe is there anything that you can tell us about what you've learned as part of your journey as an entrepreneur in creating this company, and being a person who makes games in a fine art context, a person who teaches about games in an academic, a person who develops games in a business context, and also just the New York City game development scene?
Wow, that's a lot of questions.
Well, I'm just throwing it out there as an opportunity to talk about.
So there hasn't been any formal announcements about Game Lab, but some things have happened. Like there was a public announcement about we were selling everything that was in the office, for example. So you can make of that what you will. I'm not working full time at Game Lab right now. So
what are you going to be doing?
Probably not running a company as my next thing, but I'm freelancing and consulting and working on projects. That's why I showed some things like the board game, the digital prototype that I'm working on. It's interesting. I worked in the game industry for about 6 years before I started Game Lab, including 3 with you at RGA. I started another company that ended up sort of not having a game focus and moved on from that. I freelanced for a while, but at the time when I started Game Lab, I was with Peter Lee in 2000. I was looking around and saying, I really want to make experimental games, unusual games, the equivalent of independent film, and I really didn't see another company doing that. I mean, there were some companies. I think Peter Molyneux's company, Bullfrog, was coming out with. It was post-populist, so they were doing like Magic Carpet and really interesting games at the time. But there weren't any like companies doing small, interesting, unusual games, and I created Game Lab as sort of a context for doing that. And we grew very slowly and gradually, and grew up to about 30 people in the end. And there's Katie worked with us over the years. You were the director of game design for years. It's Greg Trefries in the audience. He was on staff. Scott Price. Both of those guys were central
was
Game
an
Lab
anchor of the New York City game development scene.
for a while.
Yeah.
And I think that I learned a lot, and we did the best that we could. In retrospect, you always might have done things differently, but you can't really have any regrets.
Can you
do the best
give
you
us a
can.
glimpse at what you might have done differently?
Well,
I'm just trying to learn
one
lessons
lesson
from
that
you.
I learned is that if you starting a company, and this is extremely common in media and quote unquote creative industries. I say that quote because every industry is creative. Start a business, you become a business person, right? Especially as that business grows. And I think that was the thing that sort of was a kind of gradual dawning on you, that you start a company because you want to you want to have a platform for doing your own thing, and the bigger that gets, unless you really carefully structure things and bring in people gradually to take over those business responsibilities, you end up becoming a business person. So the last few years of Game Lab, I was doing administration, business development, very little hands-on game design work, not doing lead design on projects, and it wasn't, that wasn't really why I had started the company. That's one lesson. On the other hand, there's a lot of pleasures in running a company, and I mentioned in my talk that the sweetest pleasure of being a game designer is seeing players do things with your games that you never anticipated. And designing a company, in a sense, is designing a series of processes and a context and a way of working and a profile for the company. And then the games that emerge out of that are the sort of the play of a game. So in a sense, the company is the rules. And the unexpected things that emerge are the actual things that the company produces. So there's pleasure in that, and sort of seeing the experiences that people have and the games that are made, especially if you can be proud of those games. And I'm really proud of the work that we did at Game Lab. But I think that ultimately, I'm really interested in exploring those, what I feel are the deep mysteries of the universe that you can get by looking at chess and Go in a more direct way. And I miss that. I miss putting my hands inside those black boxes, or whatever mixed metaphor I want to use.
Excellent.
So that's a little. I could say a lot
Wonderful.
more, but
No,
I don't want
thank you. That's
to
great.
digress
That's
too
great.
much.
So let's open it up and see if there are any questions from the audience. Who wants to get a chance to heckle Eric Zimmerman? Yeah. How about you?
Or Frank Lance or Katie Salen.
Two questions.
Yes, microphone. Sorry.
Oh.
Dealing with the mic. Thank you.
Hello?
Yes.
I have two questions, and you don't have to answer the second one. The first one is, how do you define play? Like, does it have to be fun? Does it have to be entertaining? Like, what, in this kind of intellectual context, what is play? And the second question is, okay, I don't play games. I've played maybe a total of an hour in my entire life of different games. But
That can't possibly be true.
Yeah.
Crossword.
Yeah.
I mean,
You
did
don't do-
you ever take
I'm
a
sorry,
gym class?
No, I'm
Crossword
sorry.
puzzles.
I'm thinking video games. That's which
Oh,
is a
okay.
different thing. Okay, you're right.
Okay.
But as someone who is kind of in this place where I am both reluctant and kind of desperate to get into it, like, what kind of advice do you give someone who is trying to approach it in that kind of context, in terms of, like, how do you embrace playing games, particularly video games?
If you hate them.
If you know,
So first of all, no, that's a good question. And listen, I think that's an excellent question, because I think you're super articulate about a frame of mind that a lot of people have. I see it all the time. You probably see this all the time. People understand that there's something happening here that's cool, and that there's a lot of heat being thrown off by this part of culture, and many of them just don't feel it themselves. They don't get it. They want to enter into that space and participate in this process, and yet they sit down and it's like Animal Crossing, and then like 15 minutes they're like, oh my god, this is torture, So anyway, but the first question is what is play? Or maybe I'll just let you guys answer whichever part of that you like.
So I actually think the question you're asking is maybe not what is play, but so when you ask, does play have to be fun? I think if you're talking in the context of someone who wants to enter into a space of study around play or games, it's not always fun, because studying is not always fun. So one thing, if you don't if you don't enjoy, I would say if you don't enjoy play itself, the game space is not a space for you, because it is in fact the thing that you spend most of your time doing and thinking about. There have been many occasions where I have played games that I don't necessarily enjoy playing because I'm trying to learn something about sort of how they work. But play on its own is intended to be a fun activity, intended to be a voluntary thing that you sort of choose to do. I mean, I'm teaching a class this semester with Little Big Planet up at Parsons. And I would say up to mid-semester, 80% of our students hadn't played through the game. And every single session, we kept saying, and they're building things, and we'd say, well, level 7, they show you how to build that. Did you get to that level? And they're like, no. And it was like pulling teeth to get the students to do that. Part of it was a resistance around time. So there was a huge investment in entering into game courses because sometimes games take a long time to play. And it's a different kind of space to enter into often than doing some other kinds of studying where you can kind of multitask a lot. You can't really multitask when you're playing games. But once they committed and understood that the study of the play was something that they had to do really in order to understand what it is that they could make, it became an incredibly enjoyable experience for them. So I think the question for you is not just do you like to play, but sort of what is the purpose of play for you as you're beginning to imagine entering into some kind of study of games or the study of game design? Because it's something you just do. Yeah.
That's a better answer. I was just going to quote our book. But I think that was a more appropriate answer. I think we define play in, I think, chapter 22 or something.
Right.
I have to say that I play very few games, digital games now, and I have very little time to do that as a working professional in New York City. It's very time consuming, and if I didn't have a whole childhood and youth and young adulthood of tremendous hours of playing games very deeply, I mean, I don't know how I would at this point in my life sort of, hey, how do I learn about this thing? You're right, spend 15 minutes, you're like, a tenth of the way through the tutorial of some game. But now that I have this body of knowledge, and as Katie says, the major genres of games change very little. I can be on a listserv or have a quick conversation with someone about a game, and I hate to say this because this is the opposite advice, I'd look over the shoulder of someone playing a game, which you should never do because it tells you zero about the game, and get a sense of what the game was. I remember that when I was an art student, we used to do these trips to New York City, and we would visit like 50 galleries, because you would go and poke your head in and look around and then have to leave and go to the next one. But if you were immersed in that context of contemporary art and seeing it all the time and talking about it and knowing all the issues, then you could kind of get it. Okay, I see within the game of all possible art that this artist could make, they're making these kinds of moves. Now, if it was really relevant to the kinds of stuff that I was personally interested in doing, okay, we'd park there for a while, maybe for 20, 30, and 60 minutes. But for a lot of things, you'd say, okay, I get it. I see what they're doing here, move on. So games are kind of like that to me. But for just getting into them now, I think it's really hard, I guess I'm, for a lot of my research now and understanding of games is really relying on that long history of playing them. But that's why I think anytime any three of us write or speak about games and people say, well, what do I do to get into games, become a game designer? We always say play games, right? That's the first one. You just have to be playing games a lot, play a lot of games, have a big body of knowledge. And part of that is create contexts for yourself where you're playing games, Organize game nights or evenings where you're playing with other people.
It's partly weird because there's so many games. I mean, games used to be like, you would have 2 or 3 games you played your whole life. And you would get good at them over the course of many, many years. Now you're expected to sit down and play through Little Big Planet, intensely in this short little period of time, and then put it back on the shelf and take down the next product and experience that for a month or 2, and then put that on the shelf. It used to be, no, I play golf, and I play pinochle, and I play a couple of little parlor games, and that's it, and you could weave those into your life over the course of a long time.
I don't think I've played golf or pinochle, so I don't know about that.
I'm a little older than you.
Yeah. I mean,
But it's funny because, yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, what you're pointing to is that the reason you want to play games is the social context, I'm assuming. I mean, you didn't say that particularly, but I assume that you want to participate in some kind of social context in which games are an important part of that. And that's the reason anyone plays games, even single-player games. I mean, it's a good example of how even single-player games are always kind of about social interaction.
I mean, the other thing is that I think play is a great diagnostic tool of things that you care about. So, I think often in early game design classes, we introduce lots of different genres. Part of that is for you to understand that lots of different forms of games exist, but it's also, there will be a form that you actually love to play. And it's when you recognize that, oh my God, this isn't actually torture, I'm having a fantastic time, that it tells you something about the kinds of things that you want to design and the kinds of things that you're interested in. Because play is that pure response that you have to sort of enjoying yourself. And so that's something to really pay attention to about which are the games that you feel drawn to. And you don't have to be a master of all. I don't like real-time strategy games, not my deal. I don't like RPGs, not my deal. But there's a whole host of other kinds of games that are my deal. And when you look at the work that I've made and the kinds of things that I often talk about, it's really within that space. Those are the things I care about. Those are the kinds of games that I make. And those are the things that I sort of advocate for trying to understand in a deeper way. There's other people that really love real-time strategy games and know a billion times more than I do about them. And that's awesome because it's not my thing. Yeah.
I think that's a great comment. And part of the reason why games are so deep as a thing to study and to play is because they are on the plane of pleasure, right? That's one way of looking at what they are. And so as you play a game critically, part of it is really listening to your own sense of pleasure and desire. And I think that it's important to play a lot of games, but it's also important to play some games really deeply and let yourself get addicted to them and let yourself get obsessed with them. And I am presently completely addicted to Frank's game, Drop 7.
Oh, please.
And I almost feel
Available
like...
in the App Store.
I almost feel like Timothy Leary experimenting with drugs. It's like, I know it's taking time away from my life.
You know it's bad for you.
Yeah.
You can't help it.
But I'm also like deeply listening to my own sense of pleasure. What is that tickle in the back of my brain that is satisfied by playing that game, right? What is that? I mean, to me, so playing games critically and deeply, and occasionally getting obsessed with them is really important.
Great answer. Other questions? All the way in the back. You, sir. Yes. No, you. Yeah. Oh, microphone. Pass it back.
It's like he's
Pass
in the back
mic.
row.
Thank you.
Perfect.
I also have two questions.
Great.
Wow. Is this a thematic of your program?
No.
The first question is,
Two
One
speakers,
question per
two
person.
and
questions.
Eric talked a little bit about this, was how do you guys feel about the New York game scene in terms of cultural and experiential events that may be happening or not happening? And the second question is, what's your favorite game?
So, New York game scene.
I don't feel like I'm in the best position to answer that because I'm sort of not in the New York game scene in a traditional way. So.
Okay. What do you think,
I'll let
Eric?
Eric.
New York game scene.
Well,
Because there's a sense that it's anemic, right? Everyone sort of says we're not like Austin or the Pacific Northwest, where there is this thriving community.
What never happened in New York City is that there never was a large studio that was successful. So Austin, Texas, as a game scene exists largely because of Origin. Origin got big, really huge, hundreds of people working there, spun off other studios. And most game centers had some similar kind of story. That never happened in New York City. The largest game studio, to my knowledge now, is Chaos with about 60 people in it. And they're relatively new. So there never were people that could work at a company for decades, spin off from their own companies, have a deep body of mentorship and technical knowledge. On the other hand, there's a lot that makes New York very unique as in terms of the game industry. There's lots of little companies here. It's a creative capital of the world. There's a lot of media companies, advertising agencies, people from Scholastic to Sesame Workshop to Nickelodeon, VH1, MTV. There's lots of little mobile companies. There's a tremendous concentration of high quality game programs here, whether here at NYU, ITP, or Katie's program at Parsons. There's stuff going on at Columbia, Pratt, Upstate,
Hunter.
Rensselaer, and
Hunter, yeah.
and Hunter. And then there's amazing, bizarre things like Games for Change. Greg Fry's organization, Come Out and Play, that does this festival of street games. So I think there's a potential for a wonderful culture of games here. The New York City Game IGDA, International Game Developers Association chapter is very sort of closely knit and interesting group. So, I've always thought that there's a potential for New York City to make games that aren't beholden to kind of West Coast culture.
Favorite? Oh, yeah.
Well, I was going to say, New York is a very idiosyncratic place to be able to make games. And I actually think you can make things here that you can't make other places, and that's what makes it kind of cool. And I think that's why we see Come Out and Play emerge here, and it didn't emerge somewhere else. So in that sense, I think particularly as a student coming out of a program, and even as a student in a program, there's tremendous opportunity to experiment in this city because there is not the pressure that it's a city with a big industry hovering over it. I would never want to be a student in the USC program because of the weight of EA hovering over that program. Here, it's all odds are out there in terms of where you might go after you graduate, and that's a kind of beautiful thing for those that really want to begin to kind of move around the edges of what it means to make games. What does it mean to be a game designer in New York? Who knows? And that's amazing for someone who's in school thinking about what they want to do.
And it's
I
hard.
think so. I mean, you have to have that personality to want to do that, but
The EA thing is interesting because it's sort of like if you go to animation studios, many animators say they want to like end up at Pixar, right? Because that Pixar is the cutting edge and all this stuff. The problem is that those big high-end production studios, same thing in games, is that 99% of the people that work there are little tiny, incredibly narrow thing that they do, because hundreds of people work on a Pixar film. So you're not art directing or creative directing or inventing things as much as like you're playing you're a little gear in a big machine. And I know people that worked on like 45 seconds of special effects in The Lord of the Rings for 18 months. That's all they did. And to me, it's probably fulfilling on some levels, but I think a lot of people, what's interesting in a scene like New York City is that lots of little companies where you're doing smaller games, you make lots of games, you play lots of hats, you're in every major creative brainstorming meeting for projects that you're not even working on in a small company. It's just a very different sort of feeling and sensibility.
Favorite game? Favorite game? No? Favorite game? That was the second part of the question. Yeah. Do you guys want to swing at it, or do you want to think about it?
No, I mean, I find it a very hard question to answer. People always ask that. I mean, one of my favorites is Rez.
Nice. One of your favorites is?
Drop 7.
Nice.
Nice. Current obsession.
Available in the App Store.
Lots of ways. Yeah.
Yes, sir. In the cap. Yes, pass the mic.
91? This thing's totally not on.
There you go.
No, it's on there. So Chaos has 91 and what, 12 open positions now?
Oh, great.
Nice.
Oh, dudes, recruit.
Yes.
Recruit.
Wait, you're about to break the triple-digit barrier.
Yeah.
Excellent.
But I think
to the West Coast development philosophies. It might not come for you, though.
I thought Malcolm Gladwell said like 150 was the threshold for like when it. Anyway, so I've got sort of a hypothetical question for both of you because you've worked in these social game spaces, conferences, and sort of these on the street, large scale games. So everybody's talking about this wonderful digital future that we're going to be entering, where optical media is dead and everything comes directly into your house via a broadband connection, and with Facebook and Twitter, everybody's connected to everybody at every single moment of every day. That doesn't happen. Societal meltdown. We all go back to living as tribes. What sort of game do you design to rally your tribe together and get them playing when they're not worried about being eaten by a bear? New Dark Age.
You mean what's a game without technology?
Yes.
Oh, there's so
Like
many
games
games
are
without
ancient,
technology.
and what sort of game would you design without any of the modern technologies that we now take as ubiquitous?
Well, isn't your sport that?
Yeah, kind of. Although I grew up in a context of playing so many kinds of games without computers. I mean, for example, I grew up in a college town in the Midwest, Bloomington, Indiana, in the 70s. Growing up there, for example, we played neighborhood games. So I played Kick the Can, Ghost in the Graveyard, Dodgeball, huge, rich, amazing, Crack the Whip. What's that? Capture the Flag, epic games of Capture the Flag. That's one thing. We also had like weird, bizarre, imaginative games that we played where we would build Lego spaceships and then have to justify all of the technology in the ship, and if you couldn't explain it, you couldn't use it. And they were these very elaborate role-playing games in the real world, that were incredibly intricate. And so, and then there's games like, poker that was mentioned. There's games like charades. But I don't know. What your question really points to is the idea that, which is sort of the nice thing about it, is that you say, well, what is the game that would help the tribe out? And I guess that that question assumes that that games are somehow there to fill a social function. And if you were going to say what game would I design, as a design problem, I would really have to investigate what is a social function that you would want the game to fulfill. Is it a game that teaches athletic skills to help us hunt the bears that are threatening us? Is it a game that that gives us sort of social acuity or social cohesion? Is it a game that teaches individual competition, or one that encourages cooperation against maybe someone who puts on a mask and then plays a sort of mythic role of a common foe? So that's, as a design problem, I'd have to look at that. And the first thing that we always did at Game Lab in solving a design problem for someone coming up with a game is identifying what we call the play values, the core principles were. Who is it for? Why are they playing it? And how do we embody those kinds of things in the experience of the game itself, in the actual gameplay? Not just in the surface, the story tells, and the aesthetics, but in the gameplay.
How about Thunderdome? 2 enter, 1 leave.
It's a cross prize.
Let's hit another question.
Yeah.
Okay, you, sir, in the kind of bearded gentleman.
Thank you. So all three of you have done a lot of work and you talked about it tonight, in getting game design to be recognized as a discipline, and sort of having it recognized as a craft. So then I guess, without spinning off into a tangent on auteurs or anything like that, I was just wondering if you guys believe that designers have a voice, and if you do you know your own voice still? What would you say about your own voice in the games that you create?
What do you mean, do designers have a voice?
Oh, it's the way an author has a voice, right? That you read, if you read enough of an author's fiction, you can read something without their name on it, and it's, wow, this feels a lot like Haruki Murakami, like, and then you're right, it was a novel by him. That's sort of what.
Do you think designers have a voice in that way?
I think absolutely.
Do you recognize your own voice in the work that you do?
I do. I mean, I think it often depends on sort of what your role is within a team. If it's which games often are designed by a team. But I think if you look, if I were to look at the kind of collection of stuff that I've built, people can say, well, that's Katie had a hand in that. I don't know that it's the same kind of authorship, or the same kind of authorship that you would imagine around the voice of an author, because there's something different about the specificity of text versus the designing an experience of play, because again, the player is such a part of that experience that it's a negotiation kind of constantly. But I think absolutely, and I think we see it when we look at games we love. We often know kind of who made them, who was behind them, and we value who was behind them.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting thought experiment. Is you go to a party and there are 2 games that are being played. We're going to play a game, and there's 2 games being played, and one of them was designed by Richard Garriott, and one of them was designed by David Jaffe. Right, the 2 party games you have an option between these 2 games. So you can understand, you can know the 2 designers, which game was designed by which designer, or you can know which group of people at the party are going to play game A and game B. And it's hard to know which one is more important. in some ways, I'd prefer to know who I'm playing with than to know whether I'm playing a Jaffe game or a Gary game, you know? And I think that says something profound. I mean, I like the idea that a designer is an auteur, you know, and it's self-aggrandizing to me. I'm incentivized to like play that up. And yet I have to recognize that put in that situation, I'm kind of more interested in like who I'm going to be playing with than in some cases.
In that case, I'd just have to know what time it was. If I had time to play the Richard Garriott game.
Okay. Let's get another question in. You sir. Pass the mic.
Hello? Yeah, okay. I guess this question is primarily for Eric, but really could apply to anyone here. From a game entrepreneur perspective in New York City, is there a lesson that you didn't have when you started your career that you think is really important for future would-be entrepreneurs, game entrepreneurs specifically, to keep in mind if they want to make the company that they have that's locked in their heads and make it a reality?
Yeah, there's a lot of lessons. I've actually written about some of the principles that we had at Game Lab in terms of the company culture. I mean, I think one of the things that a couple of the basic things that I always thought that I think are still true is that you are what you eat. In the sense that that's sort of, I think that's from like those Schoolhouse Rock nutritional specials. That I'm dating myself by referencing Schoolhouse Rock, I think, when I watched when they originally came out. But in the sense that there's a lot of media companies in New York City that are small companies started by people that work for other ones. Hey, I'm going to start my own thing, whether they want to make an animated film or they're interested in doing some kind of educational software. But the easy stuff is always sort of work for hire, maybe not exactly what you want to do. So, you know, the company that wants to do an animated feature film ends up making little animated banner ads, and then that's their clientele. They become, which is nothing wrong with that. There's actually it's an interesting design space, but that's what they end up doing. They become more specialized. They have to hire people, the back-end technical people that know the extra intricate things you can do with banner ads, and suddenly they're moving farther and farther away from doing feature films. So I think the challenging thing is to really strategize and have a very clear vision about what you want to go. Now, that vision can change over time. I always assumed that Game Lab was going to end up, for the first few years, I assumed that we were going to start with these little web games and end up making big 3D games. We didn't do, and I was happy about that. But that shifted. But the idea that we were going to do experimental, independent, unusual games, that was there from the beginning. And we never really took on projects where someone just said, "Hey, I want a clone of this game," and when we did, we usually managed to like turn it into something else. So I think that that's really important because you are what you eat, and if you start going down one road, you're gonna end up there, and you have to be very patient and sort of grow slowly and organically to figure that out. That's one of many lessons. The other, maybe one other huge lesson is, and it's a really tough struggle, is I think the main challenge, and I actually get this from a book called The Dynamics of Software Development that Microsoft published in like 1992 or something. And they talk about the idea that authorship, a sense of authorship, is very important when you have a collaboration with people creating intellectual property, whether it's a word processing software or what have you. They're not talking about games in that book. They're talking about just software development in general. The most important thing for staff at a company is for them to feel like they are actually the authors of what they're doing collectively. And you can't, the answer to how do you do that is you just can't fake it. You actually have to give people authority and responsibility over what they do, which is very hard because when you start a company and you're, like I was a sort of a creative person or a game designer, there's a sense that like, well, this company is my creative identity, but there's that someone starts making decisions that, well, that's not what I would do, but I'm not really doing game design in that project. And you know, I think that ultimately that's a really, I think we had a pretty good culture at Game Lab for almost the whole time, where people really did feel like they were given that authority and responsibility. And in that sense, the process is really important. The process is actually the most important thing, because if you have a good process, then the problems get solved by the process, the problems that come up.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. You had your hand up, yeah.
Thanks very much, guys. As an artist and an educator, I'm interested in how you guys, as artists but also as educators, are integrating young artists into this new medium of video games, because I'm very interested in teaching young artists how to make games, not necessarily as products, but as works of art. And Jonathan Blow is here, and it was very obvious that Jonathan Blow has been coding his whole life, and Frank's been talking a lot about how this coding becomes the driving rhythm behind game design. How does an artist approach that? Do you think it's possible, besides like, oh, do some concept art, make some animations, are visual artists capable of entering this new medium and making things without being programmers? And what do you think that would look like?
Well, I'm not a programmer. So, I think that it's, I understand programming and I can do it a little bit, but I'm not a programmer. And I think there's enormous space for people who aren't programmers to be game designers. Everything that I've built isn't from the perspective of programming. And in many of them, we've had to bring programmers on as collaborators. But the vision has not ever been from the perspective of a programmer. It's certainly in the projects that I've worked on, mostly. There have been some. So I don't know that it's a closed space at all for people that isn't the thing, again, that they do or care about. Especially with the explosion of the sort of forms of games, with the big game, urban game stuff, which really begins to move into the space of performance. The machinima stuff, this notion of engines as performance spaces. You can do lots of kind of crazy things. All the mixed reality stuff where it's blending physical and digital. There's huge potential for the kind of language of games to begin to be articulated in a number of ways.
Yeah, I think that you definitely don't have to be a programmer to be a game designer, but you have to love programmers. Mm-hmm. You really do. You have to love hanging out with them. You have to enjoy talking to them. You have to have a deep respect for their craft, and you have to know a little bit about what it is that they're passionate about when they're passionate. But obviously, you can approach game design from a visual point of view. If you look at someone like Fumito Ueda, the creator of Ico and Shadow of the Colossus, he really approaches his craft from a visual point of view primarily, and yet produces these deep. Very compelling interactive experiences, but there's also the heart of the matter is programming craft, but you certainly don't have to be a coder to be a creative lead even on a project.
Yeah, the reason that I said that Rez was my favorite game is partially because I heard the talk by the lead designer who said that his vision for the game was the feeling he got was when he was in a club at 3 a.m. and everybody was dancing together. There's a moment that the DJ takes people up and the whole room is together. He said that's what the game's about. And he took his staff again and again and again to clubs and made them be there until they got it right. And he walked through the prototypes and you understood the moment that they got that. Okay, that is about art. That is about kind of the aesthetics of human experience. And I really respect that. And I think some of the most innovative games come from that desire to model something about humanity, about sort of the aesthetics of kind of being alive, whether it's being alive by yourself or being alive with other people.
Beautiful. All right, well, I think that's it. I have a couple of announcements I want to make. First of all, next week's guest lecture, unfortunately, has to be postponed. Clint Hawking had medical problems. He's going to be all right. It's not malaria. And it's not swine flu. He's going to be okay, but he's going to be here in the fall instead of next week. So we're disappointed about that. Tomorrow, James Paul G., brilliant, exciting scholar, is going to be talking about games as part of the Games for Learning Institute. And that, I think, is at 2. Is that between 2 and... Is that at 2 tomorrow? And where's the location? Someone tell me. Does someone know the location?
719 Broadway.
So 719 Broadway.
Hall, room 109.
So you should definitely go check that out. It's going to be interesting. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you very much. Thanks, guys. Thank you so much.